she's going to tell us all about the bees and whatever else.
Yeah.
Okay, take it away, Paula.
Thank you very much. Right, brilliant. Glad you all enjoyed it. Oh, that's on yours. Oh, is it on mine? Okay, I've got it. Right. Okay, so I'm going to tell you all you need to know about honey, but there is so much more that I could talk about. And as I was saying to Diana just now, that if I'd spent as much time on my herbal medicine studies as I have on researching bees and honey, I would have graduated by now. But hopefully I've got to a plateau, so now I can spend a bit more time on the herbs. So I'm going to see if I can get this to work. I did just now. Well, I now have nothing.
Try and click here.
Oh, right, okay, and then let's see.
Try and see if it works.
Oh, you'll need a marker. Right, so what I'm going to do is cover what is honey, why do the bees need honey, why do we need honey, honey as medicine, which I think you'll all be interested in. How is honey different to sugar? And that's really important to me, because when I first started beekeeping and I had a mentor and he was teaching me how to keep bees, and he took all the honey and then gave the bees sugar, and I was absolutely horrified. I had no idea this was a common practice. And when I started to question with conventional beekeepers, they thought I was mad, because they said, well, everyone knows that sugar is exactly the same as honey. Ooh, I know. So that was like a red rag to a bull, and I had to prove to them why it was different. And I think that was the real trigger for me to get really interested in honey and with the bees. No, it doesn't. Ah, medicine for the bees. We may not think that the bees actually need their honey, but they do. It is medicine for the bees. Then good and bad honey, because there is a difference. So when you're buying honey, then you need to know what is a good honey, how to identify a bad one from a good one. And I'm particularly interested in this because I know that as herbalists, you often use honey to store your herbs. And if you're going to a lot of, a lot of effort to grow your herbs chemical free and to preserve them and to do everything you can, if you then store them in a bad honey, or worse still, something that you think is honey but actually isn't, then all your hard work is undone. And then we're going to do some tasting of some honey, and I'll tell you how you can buy honey. So who am I? I'm Paula Carnell, and I'm creating a buzz about health. That's the name of my business. So what do? I'm a beekeeper, and I'm actually a naturopathic beekeeper. I found that was my little niche. So I like to work in alignment with nature, with the bees. So obviously, all of you have helped inspire this particular path of beekeeping. So what perhaps people don't realise is there's two main forms of beekeeping. There's the conventional, which is all about taking honey. So you have your bees in a box, you take all the honey, you then replace the honey with sugar. So the bees are eating white sugar from August right through to April. Now, with quite a lot of intensive beekeeping, and because of the lack of forage and because of weather, some beekeepers are feeding their bees sugar all year round. So the bees are eating sugar. Now, is it any wonder why bees are getting sick? So that's the sort of conventional. But on top of the sugar, which we can all agree is bad enough, they actually use a lot of chemical treatments inside the hive. So there's miticides, there's antibiotics, all kinds of treatments. And thankfully, because of the last 2 years, there's been a lot more conferences that have been on Zoom. And so the conventional beekeepers, the establishment in the beekeeping world, have now been exposed to more recent science, and more scientists are coming up with evidence to show that there is an effect of putting chemicals inside a hive. And one of the effects is actually infertile drones. So we're having queen failures, or the bees aren't mating successfully, the queens aren't producing healthy eggs because the drones are infertile. And what's really interesting is one of the main culprits of this is something that a lot of beekeepers think is a natural treatment inside the hive for varroa mite. And it's actually something called thymol, which is a herbal mixture with thyme. Now, so it was the first one that my beekeeper, my mentor, had sort of said, oh, you know, it's fine, it's natural. And I you know, I felt intuitively, I don't want to put anything in there, but he convinced me it was natural, we put it in. Well, now that one is directly connected to infertile drones, which are the male bees in the second generation, having been treated with thymol. So it's a real, you know, it is a real concern. And again, I'm really grateful to the IRCH because I did a talk about 3 years ago at a bee conference down in Cornwall. And I actually had the owner of Rouse Honey and a bee farmer in the audience. And I mentioned this about thymol, and I was a little bit anxious. And the guy who's a bee farmer, he then said to me afterwards, I need to see the reference, I need to see the details for that. Well, because of what we're taught here, I had actually got the reference, I had the paper, so I could send him directly the link. And now he is a treatment-free bee farmer, which is really good. So I've had a bit of an impact. So you've got the conventional beekeeping, then you've got the natural beekeeping, where you've got bees up in a tree, maybe in a hive like that, like this one, or just living wild in a tree, which is how bees would live naturally. And then it's not about honey at all. It's about observing the bees, maybe dancing around naked and putting flowers by the hives. And that wasn't really quite my thing either. Not all the time. So I then thought, yeah, I didn't like picking flowers, you know, because it's a waste. Yeah. So that's when I thought, well, I really felt that there was a spiritual connection between bees and humans. And I've been on this real quest to find what that spiritual connection is. I loved honey. I knew honey was medicine, and I wanted to find proof that it was okay to have honey. So first of all, Salim actually was one of the inspirations. One of the meal times here a few years ago, he said, had I read the Quran? And I hadn't. But it was on my reading list, and he said, oh, there's a whole chapter called The Bee. So as soon as I went home, I ordered a copy of the Quran, read the chapter of the bee, and I've got a quote in a bit that comes from that. So that was the first insight to me that actually God or powers that be say, yeah, it's okay to have honey. So did you know it takes 1 acre of blossoming trees, shrubs, and or flowers to feed 1 colony of bees? So in the world, there's 22,000 species of bees. 11 of them are honeybees. So that's around the world. In the UK, we have 270 species of bees and only 1 honeybee. Now, people tend to feel that we need to save the bees, but they don't know what's wrong with the bees or how we can save them. So the first response is, I'll become a beekeeper. Now, if you become a beekeeper and you get a box and then you go to your local group or you go online and you order a packet of bees, that packet of bees may start off at 1,000 or 10,000 bees, but it's going to grow to 50,000. So what you're doing with a colony of bees that you introduce into an area is you're bringing 50,000 more hungry mouths that need feeding in your garden or in your area. So although the honeybees will fly in a 5-mile radius, the native solitary bumblebees and solitary bees, they can only fly up to 1, maybe 2 miles. So if you bring in honeybees, you could, in effect, starve the native pollinators. And it's actually those native pollinators which are the effective ones. They're the bees that we really need. And yet we've lost 14 species in the last 50 years. And because we don't take honey from them, we don't seem to notice, we don't mind. But they are the real pollinators. And the reason they're the real pollinators is a lot of them have evolved to be connected to 1 or even like 3 species of plants, but also they're hairy all over, they're fluffy. It's the big black and white fluffy bees, the yellow fluffy bees, you know, the ones that you see around and that everyone puts on mugs thinking that they're a honeybee. They're actually the bumblebees and the solitary bees. So 1 red mason bee, which is a solitary bee, that will do the pollination work of 250 honeybees. Now, we need the honeybees now because we've destroyed the habitat of these solitary bees. So the almond crops in California, where you've got 1 million acres of almonds, supplying 80% of the world's almonds, that environment is so toxic that there's none of the 4,000 species of bees, native bees in North America, can actually survive in that environment. And so now it's compulsory that if you are a commercial beekeeper or professional beekeeper in America, you have to donate a proportion of your colonies for the mass pollination. So it starts with almonds, then it will be blueberries, cherries, apples, and the bees are put on these big trucks and they're shipped all around America. Now, if you donate your bees or provide your bees for this pollination, you will lose 40% of them due to the stress of that pollination and also the exposure to toxins. So there's now more and more research being done on the effect of those toxins on the bees because the beekeepers are losing them. So more and more beekeepers are saying, I don't want to donate my bees for this pollination. And then the almond growers, they're getting concerned because they obviously need the pollination, and they're trying to change the habitat so that they can encourage back the other pollinators. So the thing that really got me was I thought, well, hang on a minute, if our food that we're growing is killing the bees when they're pollinating it, what's it doing to the people who are actually eating that food? So my real message is I believe that what's killing the bees is also killing us. And we're not genetically connected to bees, not for 600 million years. There's flatworm, and we sort of forked out from flatworms. And yet a lot of the diseases and the behavioral issues and the effects that bees are suffering now are very, very similar to human problems. So I can talk more about that in a bit. So what exactly is honey? So it is created from bees when they collect the nectar from flowers, or aphids that are collecting honeydew on plants. They digest the honeydew goes through their system, and then the bees will feed on that excretion. So you could say that honey is either bee vomit or it's bee poop. Either way, it's gone through the digestive system, and that's what makes it really good. So when the bees are collecting nectar from plants, it's actually their carbohydrates. That's what they're collecting the nectar for. When they collect pollen, it's the protein. So they collect the protein, the pollen, which they bring back to the hive, and they actually store it in cells and they let it ferment. So they call it bee bread, or they don't call it, we call it bee bread. So it's a fermented pollen, and that provides all the protein. And then the nectar is the fuel that they use when they're flying, and also to actually feed them through the winter months. So the honey composition, this is what's really, really interesting, and this is why it is not the same as white sugar. So it's this mixture of glucose and fructose, and then you have a moisture content. So the nectar in the plants is about 80% water. So the bees have to reduce that water content to around 17%. Ideally, it would be under 20%. 17% is ideal, but 20% you can actually sell as a honey. When it has that water content lowered, it will then store indefinitely. So, but then this is the other thing that I find amazing that connects, you know, the bees connect everything, drives my husband mad when I say, yeah, bees connect everything. And for me, some of you may remember that before I started this course, I used to be an artist. So I had a 20-year career as an artist. And when I was 40, I completely collapsed and I became bed and wheelchair bound with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So I started coming to the IRCH after being a patient of Lucy Jones. And I was so inspired by the fact that she managed to get me out of the wheelchair that I wanted to be like her, and I wanted to know how to do it. So that's when I came on the course. My husband had bought me a beehive a few years before whilst I was bed and wheelchair bound, so I could lay in bed and watch the bees through my bedroom window. Now, after I'd been a patient of Lucy's, my mum then introduced me to some plant-based minerals. So I started taking the minerals, and then my health just completely transformed. So from a genetic condition where I was told I'd never walk again, wouldn't make it to 50, you know, just give me as many painkillers and antidepressants as I could swallow. I'm now 6 years healthy, and have never felt so healthy. You know, I'm really healthy and I'm able to work. I've got a business. But when I started keeping bees and I started to be well and think, right, now I've got to contribute again to society. So what's my job? I am a distributor, an agent for the minerals, because people say, what you want, you know, I want some of that. So that made sense. Studying the herbal medicine, but also the bees. And it felt like 3 separate roles. And those of you who've seen me over the years have seen how I've come with a table and it's been, you know, minerals, it's been herbal teas, you know, and I've gone through all these things, and then the honey. And now I find the more I understand about bees, the bees connect everything. So they know the medicinal properties of plants, but they also know the mineral content of plants. So they will source plants that have a rich mineral content. And so the bees are the original medical herbalists. And what they, you know, the way they store the herbs, the way they capture the magic of herbs and store it in this honey, this is what I think is so incredible. So the honey really is everything. So it's not just a food, and it's these trace minerals. So just like if we have plant-based minerals, you're having a trace amount, minuscule amount, which is why conventional medicine doesn't quite understand it, because it can't be measured. It seems like such an insignificant amount. But the bees, and as we know, it's like the spark plugs to life. It's what we need. So it doesn't matter about the quantity, it's the quality. So, oh, that was interesting. Yeah, but I should have had some words come up. Okay. Can't remember what this one was a bit about, but anyway, borage. The bees like the borage. So they go to different plants for different mineral content. And the borage is really good because it actually secretes nectar, and it replenishes the nectar within 24 seconds. So this is really cool for bees. So people think, oh yeah, I could have bees, or I have bees all over my garden because I've got a clump of lavender. Now the thing is, the lavender is only going to flower for 3 to 4 weeks. Bees need feeding 52 weeks a year. So what you need to have is a variety of plants throughout the year that can feed your bees, and particularly as we have milder winters, because if the bees are flying, and they won't soil inside the hive, they will actually leave the hive to soil. So, and if they leave the hive, they're flying, therefore they're using fuel, so then they need the nectar. So it's really important that we have plants that will produce nectar. Now there's some really interesting research by the Welsh Botanic Gardens where they've got 8,000 species of plants, and they wanted to know which plants their bees went to make their honey. So they had their honey analysed, and when they got the results back, they were astonished to find that the bees favoured 11 plants: hawthorn, dandelion, bramble, hazel, willow, clover. It was basically all the weeds in the hedgerows. That was what the bees preferred. So they have this amazing exotic platter in the botanical gardens, but they weren't going for that. So why could they be choosing the weeds? So this is the aphids. So these are the aphids that will take the honeydew, and the honeydew will go through the aphid, and then it will have this sort of sticky mess that the bees will feed on. So that's the 2 different ways that you can have honey. Now, what is interesting is over the last 4.5 years, I've been studying to be a honey sommelier in Bologna, and there, because the Italians have had this sort of amazing history of honey and lots of monofloral honeys, so single variety honeys. In the UK, we have a Dorset honey, a Scottish honey. You know, you might get rapeseed or heather, but generally our honeys are a blend, and it's because we don't have vast areas of the same plant. Whereas in Italy, they've had a history of really, you know, almost like identifying the grapes of wines. You know, they know that an acacia honey tastes like this, or dandelion honey, or a sunflower honey. So what was interesting, when I was part of the first group to do the course in English, and that attracted scientists and bee people from all around the world, but there was only 3 of us who were native English speakers. And it was really interesting because the Italians had been doing this course and setting up this standard, which then became the standard for the EU and Britain, based on the fact that honey is from the excretions of plants or of aphids collected by the bee species Apis mellifera. Now, there's 11 species of bees around the world that produce honey. And so this is why it's really difficult to get different types of honey into Europe. So when you see the rock bees, like in Bhutan or in India, you cannot actually import that honey into the UK because it's from a different species of bees. Now, once they started doing this course in English, it then attracted people from the Middle East, from the Far East, from Mexico, South America, and people are going, well, what about our bees? They've been producing honey for years. So what's wonderful is just by changing the course from exclusively Italian to English, it's now widening the scope for honey and honey definitions. So that's really interesting. But there's all kinds of other political reasons as well, and implications of banning certain species of bees. So this is an oak, so this has got the honeydew, and this is where the bees are collecting the honeydew from the aphids. So the bees, in a colony of bees, you've got one queen, 49,000 worker bees that are all female, and about 100 to 200 drones. Now, this diagram here is actually of a female worker bee. So she has a stinger. The male bees, you'll be pleased to know, they're made for love, not war. So they don't have a stinger. There's no room for both parts. So you either have a stinger or you have your bits. So the males have the bits. Also, which is interesting, which one of my bee team, Joe, who's in his 80s, he's always pleased to share this bit of knowledge, that the honeybee has the largest genitalia in its family. So the Hymenoptera, is it Hymenoptera, which is ants, wasps, and bees. So a drone honeybee is quite a, well-endowed chap. So the worker bee, she actually has two stomachs. So she has a honey crop stomach, and then she has her normal stomach. So when she's collecting the nectar from the plants, the actual nectar goes in and she stores it in this crop. So this is another reason why you want large areas of one type of plant, but you want lots of different plants. Because when the bee's flying, she's leaving the hive, she's going to a particular floral source, and she doesn't mix her honeys in her gut. She only wants to collect lavender honey or clover honey or nectar in one go. When that crop is full, she'll return to the hive and she'll be greeted by a receiver bee, another female bee. She will actually take that honey, that nectar, and what they do is they exchange it. It's called trophallaxis. So this is where you get the bee vomit thing. So they're regurgitating the nectar from one stomach, going across the tongues to the other bee, to that stomach, and it's going backwards and forwards. Now, this does several things. It actually adds the gut enzymes. So the good bacteria that you get in honey, it comes from the guts of these bees. But it also helps evaporate the honey, so reduce the water content. And it also helps to transform the sugars. So, and I'm going to have to say it's too technical for me to do from memory, but it's words like disaccharides and things like tricky. All those words are all to do with what happens there. So I'm not even going to try and do that. But I'm sure you all know that. So yeah. I find I can read it, I can understand it in my head, but then I have to really, really understand it and then speak it. And then once I've spoken it a few times, I've got it, but I haven't quite got that one yet to share, but next time. So why do the bees need honey? It amazed me. To me, it was quite obvious bees needed honey to feed themselves, but it really shocked me when my sister-in-law, who was a teacher, said to me, well, what do bees need honey for anyway? And I was so shocked, but of course, we forget what we know. And the thing is, the bees need honey. Well, for two things, actually, I'll go back a bit. They need the honey to produce their wax. So the wax in the hive is made of honey, and bees need 8 kilos of wax to make 1 kilo, 8 kilos of honey to make 1 kilo of wax. So that's a lot of honey. And they also need it to feed them through the winter. That's the main thing. It is their food, and actually in Britain, they need it through the summer as well, if they're collecting it. This year, we thought we'd have a really good crop of dandelion honey because dandelions were out in April, lovely weather. The apple blossom wasn't out, the blackthorn had gone over, the may wasn't out, so it was just dandelions. The hives were covered in yellow, the bees had great big yellow pollen sacs. We're like, brilliant, and it's my favourite honey. Anyway, May, wet and cold, the bees ate it all, so there was none left for us. So that's why dandelion honey is really quite difficult to get. So the bees will cover 88,500 kilometres, visiting 2 million flowers to produce 500 grams of honey, a pound jar. So that's quite a lot, but they work as a team. So one bee in its whole lifetime will produce this much honey. So that is 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. And that's what the bee will produce. So they really have to work together. And this is why it's okay to lick the knife when you actually use honey, because every drop is so precious. You know, don't waste it. So here are the bees, and they're actually making the wax comb. So they actually create these chains. They hold hands, and they actually have these discs of wax that come out from their abdomen. They secrete these discs, and then the other bees will take the discs and chew and mold them into their hexagon shapes. So again, they're working as a community. So you can see the wax on just there. And then this is where they're deciding the shape. And it's so clever how they do it. And all the shapes are uniform. Now, the size of the wax cells determines the sex of the eggs. So the worker bees are a bit smaller than the drones. So the drone cells are bigger cells. Now, when the worker bees make the cells, they do a small one if they think, oh, we need more worker bees. And when the female queen, when she lowers her abdomen into the cell, because the cell is smaller, it squeezes her abdomen, pushes the spermatheca and releases sperm and fertilizes the egg. So the female bees are from fertilized eggs. When it's a bigger cell, she lowers her abdomen, it isn't compressed, no sperm's released, and so she produces a male unfertilized egg. So it's actually the community of bees, it's not the queen, it's all the bees who decide the balance of male and female. Now, beekeepers will actually pull out drones, they'll pull out females, they'll, manipulate it, but the bees will always try and recorrect that balance. Homeostasis, status. I must use big words when I'm talking. So this is the honey inside in the hive, and it's capped. So when they filled a cell with honey, they then put a thin wax layer on the top, and that's the cappings. Now, if you're going to use beeswax to make balms, you want what's called super wax, and that is the wax from the cappings. So that has been taken off. So it means that no eggs, no brood have actually been inside those cells. It's only the honey, and that's really quite rare to find, because you have to extract the honey, you cut off the cappings. We give the cappings back to the bees so they can clean it, they lick off all the honey, and then you get these discs of wax. But it is quite, it's precious. So when you're buying your wax, make sure it's super wax. Now, wax does actually contain, because it's made from the honey, it contains residues of any pesticides that the bees have been exposed to when they've taken the nectar. And there's actually been tests on wax, then they found residues of chemicals that have been banned for over 10 years. So either people are still using chemicals that were left in their garage, even after they've been banned, or the residues stay in the soil and the plants are still breaking them down. Either way, it's going to be in the beeswax. And this is why Australian beeswax is premium, because the Australians don't have the varroa mite, and so Australians don't use chemicals inside their hives. In the UK, in Europe, everywhere else in the world, there's this massive practice of using chemicals. So it's not just the pesticides from the plants, it's the chemicals from the beekeepers that you're going to get in the wax. So when we say, oh yes, eat local honey, it's better for you, it's only better for you on the level that the herbs that you need to heal you grow in your environment. But if your environment is toxic and those herbs are sprayed with goodness knows what, and the soil is polluted and the beekeepers using miticides, then no, that honey is not going to be the best for you. You'd be better off getting honey from Australia or Madagascar or Bulgaria, Bhutan, somewhere where they're not using chemicals in their hives. So why do we need honey? So it's just wonderful. There's nothing better than having the honey coming out from the hive. So it has so many activities, and it's not just the honey, it's because of the traces of the pollen, of the cells, the wax, the propolis that you get inside the hive. There's going to be elements of all of this, but of course all the plants. So you've got the antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, anti-diabetic. This is a really clever one, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Anti-cancer. So some honeys have been proven to actually prevent the cells, damaged cells, from replicating. So isn't that amazing? So, you know, it can actually go straight into the mitochondria and rewrite how the cells are replicating. So humans have been using honey for thousands of years, and the Egyptians are well known for using the honey. The Egyptian kings and queens, they used to eat the royal jelly. Now, the royal jelly is what all bees are fed for the first 3 days of their life. So the bees will they secrete this royal jelly from their glands in their head, and they feed it to all the eggs for 3 days. But the queen is only fed royal jelly for the rest of her life. And what it does is it stimulates the hormones to develop her ovaries. So that's what it's doing. However, what it also does is it slows down the decay of cells. So the Egyptian kings and queens would actually manage to preserve their bodies while they were alive. They looked a lot younger than their years because they were eating the royal jelly. I don't advocate, particularly in the UK, of harvesting royal jelly because the bees really need it. It is the food for the bees, and it takes a lot of energy for them to actually produce it. But it's good to be aware of how royal jelly is produced. So in quite a lot of Mediterranean countries where they have better weather and there's a lot of intensive queen rearing, they will actually harvest royal jelly. It will be farmed so that it can be used for medicinal purposes. So I would recommend that royal jelly would only really be used for people seriously, seriously ill. You know, it's not an everyday thing that people should be using. We should really save it for people that, you know, you've got a chance of turning around their health, and then use it in small doses. So mixing it with honey and having perhaps a teaspoon a day, maybe 2 teaspoons at a push. So it's not something to be ignored. So we think about the honey hunters. So you've seen the cave paintings where people climbing up the trees and collecting the honey. So honey was humans' first sugar. So I don't know quite how they found it. They're perhaps walking through the jungle and a drop of honey dropped on their head, licked their lips and thought, wow, I like this. And then started climbing up trees to find the bees and take the honey. But there's been honey farmed for about 8,000 years, or honey collected. Bees have been kept. So in the Middle East, they would use these clay tubes, and the bees would be making their hives in these clay tubes or date palm trunks. And because the bees would have their brood near the entrance of the hive, and then they store their honey at the back, by having a big pile of tubes, you could steal the honey from the back, because the bees will be coming and going the other side of the wall. So you'd have this wall of tubes. So humans have found ways of taking honey without needing bee suits and lots of other gadgets. So there's actually cave paintings in Spain which show that people climbing up trees and collecting honey. And it still happens in the Himalayas, but the bee species they collect from is Apis dorsata or Apis laboriosa, which is the giant Asian honeybee. And it's actually illegal to import that honey into Europe. And I've got a friend who was working with some indigenous people in India who'd been buying the honey for years, had been importing it through Europe, managed to get it in. January this year, he had to pay £3,000 to have it destroyed because it's not from the Apis mellifera bee. So what's happened with Brexit is they're going back to the original document, and, you know, it's criminal. But what also happens is you have the supermarkets who are selling big drums of honey and honey really cheap. So what they're doing is they're going to these indigenous people, because the people can't sell their honey at the premium that it should be, they're buying it, paying them peanuts, and then mixing it with sugar syrup, rice syrup, and Apis mellifera honey. And because it's sold in such vast quantities in big drums, it's sneaking in and being sold as honey. So, you know, it's this mixed thing that it really needs to be looked into, but it comes down to awareness. And so when you see honey and it says on the back a blend of EU and non-EU countries, it's not honey. So there we have the Egyptians with their carvings of bees. So bees were really sacred. And what I found as well really interesting when I went to Bhutan is the Buddhist monks in Bhutan believe that the highest level of reincarnation is as a bee. So they don't actually eat honey, they don't use beeswax in Bhutan. However, they do believe that they are the highest level and that we should learn from the bees. So I find that really interesting that at the moment there's a real calling by a lot of people to do something with bees, to connect with bees, to learn from bees. And perhaps it is all these lamas who are now saying, right, we've got to shake up humanity. We're going to come and teach people what we need to know about bees. So here I am in Oman a few years ago, and this is the date palm hives. So this is actually Apis florea, so a different type of honeybee, but really good honey. Now in Oman, again, it's all mountainous, desert. You'd think, how are they going to have much honey there? They have lots and lots of honey. They have these plants that are like the cedar. I think we're going to taste some cedar in a bit, which is also known of as the holy thorn. So the crown of thorns is made from the cedar tree. And they're really melliferous plants. So the actual, the plant will secrete a lot of nectar. But I think it goes deeper than that. In Oman, the Sultan has declared that they shouldn't be using chemicals in their agriculture. So they're valuing their soil. But also because of their faith, their strong faith, they have a real deep spirituality when they're working with bees. So they're grateful for the honey, they're grateful for the bees. They pray before they visit the bees, they pray after they've taken honey. They have this respect, a healthy respect, which I think in the West we've lost. We seem to think of bees as not having a soul, not having a spirit, and just being honey factories. So it's really nice to see that the bees are rewarding people, but in the same way the people are valuing the honey, so they'll have a bottle of honey in their medicine cabinet. And then I did learn only a couple of days ago that in quite a few places in Africa and in some places in the Middle East, you'll have traditional hospitals, and outside there'll be people selling a spoonful of honey, so that you could buy a spoonful of honey to take into the hospital to feed your loved ones who are sick. So that's how revered honey is, that you can buy it by the spoon. So honey is medicine. This is really interesting. There's been a lot of work going on in Iraq and in the Middle East and Turkey, so where honey has been used for years. So I'll let you read this. So the Department of Immunogenetics in Iraq, they found a sugar, which is the Niger-Gura-Lyra saccharide. See what I mean about all these saccharide things? Present in honey has been observed to have an immunopotentiating effects. So they really are helping with the immune system. So again, this comes back to the, should you have local honey, or which is best, local honey or other honey? And there was research in Finland, and there's been a lot of research about which is best, local honeys, and it is quite complicated, but it basically comes down to the fact that any good honey boosts the immune system. And the idea that you would have a local honey is because you're thinking, oh, the bees are fed on the pollen that is triggering your allergy. However, most allergies are triggered by airborne pollen, whereas the bees are collecting pollen from flowers, which you're probably not going to be allergic to. However, you might get traces of it. But they did some research in Finland on birch honey and birch pollen, because about 10% of the population are affected by hay fever from birch pollen. And they actually found that the people, they did double-blind trials, and they had birch honey, then they had a normal non-birch honey, but a good honey, then they had a complete honey substitute that tasted like honey. And they found that the people with the birch honey had a 48% reduced hay fever symptoms. The people who took the normal honey had 38% reduced symptoms. People that took the sugar only had like 5%, so it was like a placebo effect. So there could be something in having local pollen, but actually it's quite negligible. So again, it comes down to having a really good honey. So Ayurvedics, they describe honey as the nectar of life. And also honey's been used widely for thousands of years for skin grafts. So any kind of injury with skins, they would use honey. So this could be due to the fact about cell replication and how it just, actually it's hydrophilic hygroscopic. So it draws out the water, and bacteria needs water to thrive. So if you put honey on your skin, it actually draws out the water, so then the bacteria die. So, you know, it is a really good thing. This is from the Quran. So it says, put your hives in the mountains and in the trees and where they choose, and from their bellies emerges a fluid of diverse colours, containing healing for the people. Surely in this is a sign for those who reflect. And I love it's that last bit, surely in this is a sign for those who reflect. So if you start to reflect about the diverse colours of honey, and you can see the different colours we've got there, then that reflects the diverse plants that the bees are going to, which connects with the herbs. So again, it has the antioxidant capacity. So here's a frame with pollens in, and you are going to get traces of the pollens. And so these are all the other products or properties that have been found in honey. They found 180 different compounds in honey. It's just incredible stuff. There's just so much. It's not a simple glucose, fructose, minerals thing. 180 different compounds. Now, there's also, this is the stingless bee. Oh, I should have had a, so the stingless bee, very interesting. You find them across the tropics, and people have been collecting honey from stingless bees or melipona or trigona bees for thousands and thousands of years. And it's a very liquid honey, so it's about 22% water and tastes like lemons, very citrusy, but it's been used to treat the eyes. So it would be used as eye drops, thousands and thousands of years. And this is what the colony looked like. So to farm this honey, they would actually put a coconut shell next to it. So the bee will make more pots, and they make a little wax pot, and they put, they would lay an egg in and put some nectar in, and then the nectar would turn into honey, but they actually store it as well as having just eggs. So they're a cross between the bumblebees and the honeybees. But what I find really interesting, I was in Canada at Apimondia Bee Conference, and I was asked to do a presentation about the bees in Bhutan. And because I had something about stingless bees there, I had some Asians come up and they say, oh, well, you know, we didn't know there were stingless bees in Bhutan. And then they were showing me videos of harvesting stingless bee honey, which I hadn't seen. And they showed me this video. And so there's all these people harvesting, and then there's a bloke in the background going like this. And I'm like, but they're stingless bees. What's he doing? And he goes, oh no, they bite. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what do they bite? They bite the eyes. Now, isn't that interesting that they would go for the eyes, which is where the honey heals? Now, this connects to the bee sting therapy. So the Chinese used to use bee stings before needles in acupuncture. And a chap I met in Oman is an apitherapist, and he uses bee sting therapy. And I wasn't too sure about that. I wasn't sure about bees dying when they sting, but I learned a lot from him. And he was saying, if you put the bee sting on the meridians of where you want to be healed, you know, it will activate the immune system and you can be healed. So what we've been doing with my bee team is when any of us are stung, we then look at Louise Hay's brilliant book on, you know, You Can Heal Yourself, where she links it with emotions or with problems with the body, and also looking at meridians. And there's always a link. It's really, really interesting. And the lengths that bees will go to sting you. So you could be with shorts, bare legs and flip-flops, but they'll actually crawl, you know, up a sleeve and then down and into a glove and then sting you there. You know, so they know where to heal you. So it's really interesting. So the fact that the melipona bees will bite on the eyes, but there isn't any research about connecting the activity of bees, you know, stinging you or biting you to heal you. But I believe that's something that could be really interesting. So this is the Medi honey. I find the Medi honey really interesting because they use Manuka. And I'm currently working with some Manuka beekeepers in New Zealand who are launching some honey for the UK. And they've also got the most active Manuka honey that they're launching this year called Mars, only 50 jars with an MGO of about 1,700. So they're going to be selling it in Australia, New Zealand dollars, 8,888. And they're calling it Mars. It's in these mouse blown jars. But I've been learning now a lot more about Manuka honey. Now, all honey, or most honeys, will produce, if they're heated, MgO, which is methyl glyoxal. Now, that can be toxic to some people. So if you heat honey, it can be dangerous. So you shouldn't really be heating up your honey. But the Manuka plant, which is part of the tea tree family, actually naturally contains methyl glyoxal. So Manuka honey contains methyl glyoxal naturally, but it also means that some people could have a bad reaction to Manuka honey. So you have got to be careful. And the methyl glyoxal, the higher the value of that, the higher the honey, but it also means, or the more expensive the honey, but it also means that the bees have more exclusively fed on that one plant. So if you have a Manuka honey that's got a grade of say 100, it means that it's not 100% Manuka honey. The bees would have fed on some Manuka, but they would have gone on clover, they would have gone on dandelions, whatever else is around. So when you get to the 1700 MgO, it means that they have been in an area where they've only been able to feed on Manuka. And this is the really interesting thing, because more Manuka honey is sold in the world than is produced. Now, Manuka honey that is from the plants that are wild on the mountaintops of New Zealand with clean air, clean water, with the Maori farming on it, is going to have a very different energetic property to Manuka honey, where the Manuka has been grown as a monoculture in China and the bees farmed in to pollinate it. So
I saw that, like, grow it in polytunnels and seal them.
Yeah.
So put the bees in, they kill the bees.
I know.
They've got a short lifespan.
It's
and
just
they
criminal.
literally replace the hive.
This is the thing, you see, honeybees are not endangered, because we lose the bees, we breed more. It's all the other bees. Yeah. And this is the problem. But because it's got the word Manuka, people will buy it. Mm. And the only reason Manuka is as famous as it is because the government were trying to help with economic development for the Maori in New Zealand. And they knew their honey was medicinal, but it tasted a bit bad and they couldn't sell it. And the government had funding to support with, you know, new ways of earning money. And so what they did was they clubbed together with a nation's worth of beekeepers, all with their samples, and they had it all medically tested. No other honey in the world has been tested to that level. For us to test a dandelion honey in Britain, I'd have to get about 150 beekeepers who only had dandelion honey. We'd have to have support from the government to actually get it tested. I believe dandelion honey has as good a medicinal properties as a good Manuka honey, but it just hasn't been proven and probably never will, you know, which is a shame. But, you know, it is what it is. But I think it's that awareness. So when you have people coming to you saying, oh, you know, I pay £30 a jar for Manuka honey. Well, £30 a jar is probably not much better than having a really good anything else in the world organic honey. But, you know, you really want to be paying £60 to £80 a jar to be getting something that's worthwhile. And I have got some good Manuka honey. So if anybody's interested in tasting some, I've got some at the back. So yeah, so it has been shown. Now, what I find really interesting is for this Medi honey, they heat it, and you think, well, you're killing all the natural bacteria. So, you know, I'm really curious to know what it is that makes medical honey still work, but it is being used. Oh, doesn't it?
Not as a like that. We use that as work. But the main reason we use it is because it turns into liquid on the surface of the wound, and then that causes the rocky slug to dissolve.
Oh gosh!
So it's not you're not lasting the benefits of the honey.
No.
You're just using it as a dressing.
Oh, crikey!
But when patients bring in their own jars of honey, put that on, and then top because we're not allowed to touch it. It works very differently. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think, I mean, if I travel anywhere, which I'm probably not going to be doing for the foreseeable future, but I would always have a jar of honey. I take a jar of my bees' honey, because if I have a cut or anything like that, and the French clay, pot of honey, propolis, three essential things, and actually coconut oil and a spoon. So I always have everywhere with me. So yeah, reproductive system. No, that's quite interesting, because honey, the whole word honeymoon comes from the idea that you would feed the couple, the wedded couple, honey for the first month to ensure that she would be fertile. And, you know, in the Bible, in lots of other religious scripts, it talks about the land of milk and honey, which is very much less about food, but more about fertility. So fertile land and fertility of the people in that land. And another interesting thing is that pagans, when they look at the root of words, honey is often miel, or it's an M word. There's lots of different words, and mead comes from honey. And it is said that honey was the first medicine, and the word medicine comes from miel, so actually from honey. So, you know, that's interesting. And actually Britain was the honey isles. It was always called the honey isles, which is incredible because you don't think of it as being a great place for honey, but apparently once it was. So, oh, that was the antiviral, but I meant to have lots of words that come up there. No, they're not coming up. I don't know. So how is honey different to sugar? So it's a combination of two sugars, glucose and fructose, in equal parts. And it's that combination that then makes the sucrose. So it's, oh yeah, so this is the 180 other substances. Now this is the bit I really, really love. It's the fact that when the bees add their enzymes from their guts, it then has this effect of splitting the sugars, so that when we eat the honey, it doesn't go straight to the liver, it goes straight to the brain. And this is the problem with diabetes, is that sugars go to the liver. We have too much sugar in the liver, and then, you know, your body can't process it. But with honey, so this is why you should have honey about an hour before bed, because then your brain won't be starved. So you won't go into this metabolic stress at about 4 o'clock in the morning where you're hungry or you've had a sugar level drop. So honey is really good for an hour before bedtime, because it will just give your brain enough food to get through the night. So I found this really interesting. And this book here, The New Honey Revolution, by a doctor, an American doctor, so it's quite repetitive. But yeah, really, really interesting. Really interesting book. And he goes into a lot more depth about how the effects of the liver are influenced by honey. So I like this with the borage. So the Romans, they used to grow borage because the honey was actually happy honey. They knew they felt better when they had their borage honey. So, and then it's been tested to show that it actually has the similar effect as statins. So there we go. We can just be giving people more borage honey. But again, finding borage honey is quite difficult. I got sent a sample recently, and it was obviously adulterated. It just tasted starchy. It wasn't that nice sweet. Now borage honey, because it's got a high fructose level, no, this is new. It's always been thought until very, very recently that honey will crystallize if it's got a high glucose level. It's now been shown that it's a high pollen level. So normally you would say that borage honey wouldn't actually crystallize, and neither would acacia honey, whereas you'd get other honeys like rapeseed that would crystallize really, really quickly. And so that was always put down to the sugar levels, but it didn't always make sense, because you'd get some honeys that would crystallize and some that wouldn't. It's now been shown it's actually the pollen count. So when the bees are storing the honey, or when they're collecting the honey, depending on the pollen in the air, the pollen in the hive, it can actually then have an impact on whether the honey will crystallize. So you could get some honeys that shouldn't really crystallize and then do, and that's due to the pollen. So medicine for bees. So this is a healthy brood. The bees really need the honey, and as it was shown with the Welsh Botanic Gardens, they actually choose the honey that has the most nutrition. Now, this perhaps sort of steps into the woo-woo, but there's a beekeeper in America who I've done quite a bit of work with, called Jacqueline Freeman. And she wrote a book called The Song of Increase. And I absolutely love what she does. So she's been a beekeeper for 15 years. She's a biodynamic farmer for like 30 years. And she writes about what happened to the bees. So she said, oh, it's spring, the bees are on this, you know, the queen's doing that, da, da, da. But she meditates with the bees and the bees tell her stuff. So it took a good sort of 7 or 8 years before the bees started talking back to her. So in her book, Song of Increase, she talks about what's happening, you know, like earthed, you know, grounded, you know, this is the practicalities. And then she'll say in our own words, which is what the bees have told her is happening. And that is just phenomenal. And when you read that, you can tell in your gut that it's true. So this is what I think is happening, and what Jacqueline has led me to come to the conclusion of. So the plants, they have to communicate to the bees. They have to let the bees know that they need pollinating. So they want the bees to come and pick up the pollen and rub it onto other plants so they can procreate. And the reward for that is the nectar. But the bees are not going to fly to a plant if there's no nectar. But how do they know there's no nectar? Now, I was given an apricot tree, and it was given for Christmas, so we planted it in the new year. And I thought, gosh, my bees don't know I've got an apricot tree, and it's at the front of the garden and the bees are in the back garden. And how are they going to know? And it will bloom in early spring. So how will the bees know to leave their hive when it's a bit chilly to come to my apricot tree? So of course I told the bees, but just in case, you know, they weren't listening, or it was different bees that were flying around in March, April. So I had to start looking up and thinking, what am I going to do? You know, because I won't get any apricots. Well, then I found that plants communicate with the colour. So they'll have ultraviolet rays, which will guide the bees in. So if they're flying over, they see these tram lines. They have scent. But the incredible thing is they have an electrical field. So every living thing has this electrical field. So it's like a song. So they're sending out this song that the bees pick up on. When the bees are flying, they have a positive electrical charge. The plants have a negative electrical charge, pulled in like magnets. When the bee lands on the plant and drinks the nectar, the polarity changes on the flower. So this is why when you're watching plants and you'll see, you know, like a clump of lavender, and you'll see a bee go to one flower and then fly past 2 or 3 and go to the next one. You're like, well, what's wrong with those ones? It's because they've already got that footprint of another bee having been there, and the nectar hasn't replenished. So isn't that amazing? And this is why EMF radiation is so dangerous for nature, because the man-made electricity, so the Wi-Fi, the phones, the electrical, it creates a pulse, and that pulse disrupts the natural electrical field. And of course, we are electrical beings. Our heart is an electrical motor, so we're sending out a field. So what happens with the bees is they can't find their way back. The communication between the plants gets disrupted, and then they can't always find their way back to the hive. So this is why it's an irregular thing. It's not all bees can't find their way back. And this comes back to the health of the hive. If the bees are fed sugar, they've basically got no immunity, and they've also got no food. So they're in a state of fight or flight. They're always trying to find more forage. If they are fed sugar, they are calmer. And a calm, healthy hive will spend the majority of its time resting, so that when they have to do something like build a load of wax, or they have to collect a lot of nectar, they've got the resources to do it. Now, when bees have been exposed to toxins, environmental toxins, whether it's pesticides, chemicals, sugar, EMF radiation, they are unable to rest. They exhibit behaviors like ADHD. They're shaking. They can't sit still. They can't meditate. They can't rest. They can't heal. And so this is why honey is so important for the bees. Also, if the bees have got a healthy store of honey, they then can relax and they spend more time grooming, so they can keep themselves clean from pests and diseases. So honey is really, really key. So what we do with our bees is we actually line the hives with a layer of propolis, but also with shungite, which is this, if you're all familiar with shungite, I think Diana did a thing about shungite. Shungite is 99% carbon, comes from this little village in Russia, and it's used in pendants and things for EMF radiation, and it comes off in your hands, you know, it's black. But so it acts as a physical barrier. But what's really interesting about shungite, 99% carbon, the 1% contains every element on the periodic table. When they carbon dated this shungite, they found it predated planet Earth. So it's a meteorite that had come in and landed. Isn't that amazing? But in America, they've been doing studies of bees that have shungite around their hives. And because they're protected from EMF radiation inside the hives, they can then heal. So the cells regenerate and they can get healthy. So it's the same with humans. If we can sleep, if we can be protected, if we can turn the Wi-Fi off at night, you know, our bodies can regenerate and heal. So we're learning so much about bees that I think we can, you know, transfer to humans. How am I doing for time? So thyme honey. So I'm just going to, you know, do a little bit about thyme honey. So there was a professor in New Zealand who was finding it. He did all sorts of studies on thyme honey. So I suppose he was trying to find a different version of Manuka. And so there are some studies going into different plants. The Greeks, they believe that thyme honey is the best in the world, not even the ancient Greeks, modern Greeks as well. They'll just go, there's no other honey. Really tragically, the fires this year destroyed acres and acres of thyme and colonies of bees. So, you know, really, really difficult. And I like this because each of the honeys have different colours, but when you do pollen analysis, which is how honey is normally graded, you see the different shapes of pollen. And it is quite interesting, those different shapes. And anybody who's looked at Moto with the crystals of water, and I think that's quite interesting to sort of compare that with honey. So if you have an adulterated honey, the crystals don't look very, very symmetrical. Whereas with a pure honey, you'll get these lovely pure pollen shapes. So the Manuka, that is used for all kinds of things. You know, it is good stuff. And I was always a bit skeptical about Manuka honey, really, because I knew about the marketing and the research side. But now I'm learning a lot more about Manuka and also that understanding of the wild plants. So the other thing about, actually I'll talk about it in a minute. But, so yeah, so the Manuka, this is what the Manuka plant looks like. It has really high levels of methyl glyoxal, which can also, it can either be rated as an MgO level, or it can be rated as UMF. So the UMF is a lower number, and I have got a chart if anybody wants to know what is comparable. So I think a UMF 33 would be equivalent to an MgO of 1700 or 1600. So the UMF might be only 5 or 6, but that's actually quite good. And actually, the methyl glyoxal is actually a natural product that comes into the plants as a result of photosynthesis. So this is why certain plants will have it and others won't. So that's really interesting. And I wonder if that's, again, connected with the soil. If you've got mineral content in the plant, will that affect the photosynthesis? So that's another area of research. So dandelions. Now, dandelion honey is my favourite honey. It's really hard to get. I haven't even got a sample for you to taste. But what I love about dandelions, and 5 days a week I do a bee safari for one of my clients. And, you know, I share this story and I love it because it's just this dandelions is changing the world. So people hate their dandelions, you know, and they're on this thing of killing the dandelions. I know from all of you, it's a real desert island herb. Now, what is really clever is the roots. They've got the deep tap roots, and I'm sure you'll know this, but they break down the metallic minerals, the calcium and potassium. They bring it out, digest it, bring it up to the leaves so that you actually have this digestible form of calcium and potassium. If you don't pick your dandelions or dig them up or poison them, those leaves will go into the soil and bring those minerals to the top. Now, what's really interesting, which Jacqueline Freeman suggested, but I've now noticed from experience, the seeds of the dandelion head will only take in soil that needs calcium and potassium. So my dad has had dandelions in his lawn that he's been digging up for 50 odd years. Where I live, I moved there 17 years ago. I did leave home before that, but this house 17 years ago. There's a field behind that was full of dandelions 17 years ago, and it's only used for, you know, it's cut once a year or grazed, so never anything is put on it. Over the 17 years, the dandelions have been marching across that field, and this year there were no dandelions in the field. Our garden, all our neighbours' gardens, full of dandelions. So if you leave a plant to be, it will rebalance, and this connects with wilding and rewilding. So we think oh, I'm going to rewild an area, and 500 years ago that area was full of oak trees, so I'm going to plant a load of oak trees. It's only full of oak trees because the Elizabethans realised it was unsustainable to keep cutting down oak trees to make battleships, and it cost 2,500 trees to build one battleship. I mean, horrific. So then they cleared other stuff and planted oak forests. So we're rewilding on landscape that's already being changed by man. So what we have to do is allow nature to get on with it. So we really need these wild areas. So when I share the story of the dandelions, I just every day there'll be a couple where normally it's the man who's been poisoning the dandelions. The wife's been going, I told you, you know, you shouldn't be keeping them. And because he's heard it from another woman, not his wife, he's like, oh, so I don't need to be poisoning them anymore. I don't need to be, you know, digging them up. So my mission is to produce dandelion honey that people will taste, to get dandelion honey tested to show how medicinally valuable it is. So then we stop killing dandelions, because it's such a valuable crop for bees and it's such a valuable medicine for humans. But something that has sort of clicked with me recently is the companies that produce the weed killers are producing weed killers and this massive marketing campaign against our best free medicine. And it's not just our most valuable medicine, it's the bees' medicine. And if you ask people, why do you not like dandelions? They don't know. You know, it's just been this brainwashing for years. So if I can get people to really appreciate dandelion honey or understand that the bees need dandelion honey, then what's killing the bees is killing us, you know, so let's stop killing bees and stop killing ourselves. And so here's a shot that shows the difference between dandelion and sunflower. And I love how the sunflower pollen is very much like the sunflower. You know, you've got these shapes and the colours, sunshine, you've got these wonderful flowers of sunshine. And the sunflower is very interesting honey because it was the first honey to raise awareness about the neonicotinoids that were used on treated seeds, so systemic pesticides. So a systemic pesticide is a combination of 3 neonics and 2 fungicides that coat a seed. So when that seed grows, every part of that plant is toxic. So even if a bird or a butterfly or a bee drinks a drop of water that's on one of the leaves, it will be poisoned. You also get a 94% runoff of these neonics into the soil. So it took 20 years for bee scientists to prove that the neonics were killing bees. So then there was a banning of the neonics, but farmers are allowed to use neonics on crops that aren't pollinated by bees. And those crops that are pollinated by bees, they do wildflower strips, which are basically drawing up the neonics, attracting the bees to be poisoned. I mean, you could think that there was some kind of conspiracy going on. You know, how can we kill the insects? So it was when beekeepers in the 90s or late 80s, they took their bees out to get the sunflower honey and all their bees died and they were like, what's happened? And then they found that the seeds had changed. So it's now harder to get a sunflower honey because it's only in organic countries or organic areas that you can actually get sunflower honey, because people are still using treated seeds. But what is interesting is in France, they banned neonics 10 years ago. So they've had 10 years without neonics. Last year, 2020, they had their worst loss of bees is glyphosate, because the glyphosate is now drenched on crops. And that's what they're now realizing, because glyphosate has been shown to destroy the gut biome of honeybees. And in February this year, there was a paper that showed that it's destroying the gut biome of humans. How funny. You know, we're sharing the same environment. So we cannot be thinking if we put chemicals anywhere, where are they going to go? There's no such place as a way. You know, it's just all getting recycled. The arbutus, the strawberry tree, I've got some of that honey for you to taste. It's the bitterest honey in the world. And that has had quite a lot of trials done on it. So it is a really medicinal honey. And I think what can be interesting is because of the bitterness. So is it because it's a bitter honey, it stimulates different digestive enzymes? So can that have a different effect on us all? So good and bad honey, and tasting and buying honey. So I'm going to talk about that. And then we're done. So this is a really bad honey. This is fermented. Now, when you look at honey, sometimes you will see it runny at the top and solid at the bottom, and you'll think, oh, it's gone off, but that's okay, because honey will tend to crystallize from the bottom up. But when it crystallizes from the top down, then that is fermented, and you'll get when you open the lid on that. And that was the local honey that I bought from the farm shop, because everywhere I go I buy honey. And I thought it looked a bit runny, and I lifted the lid, and it, you know, it smells a bit vinegary, and then over time it went like that. So I've kept it just to show how awful a honey can be. So, you know, if it has bubbles in, and the reason for that is because the water content would be too high. So either the beekeeper, when he extracted the honey, if the bees hadn't fully capped all the cells, it meant the honey wasn't ripe. So the bees hadn't reduced the water content. So if he had too much of a layer of that, then that would have too high a water content. Maybe he didn't even test the water content before he bottled his honey. The other thing is, if he extracted the honey and didn't have it in a sealed container straight away, because the honey attracts water, it would draw the moisture from the air. So that can be another thing. So if you have honey and you have the lid off and you have it in your kitchen or in your bathroom, for whatever reason, you know, it is more likely to ferment. But honey should stay, if you keep it at a constant temperature, it will last indefinitely. So in the Egyptian tombs, they found pots of honey, and I like this story. They, you know, they sort of went down deep into the tombs, and then they found this pot, and they lifted the lid up and had a sniff and thought, oh, it smells like honey, looks like honey, you know, moves like honey. Someone put their finger in, tastes like honey. Wow, must be honey. Passed it all around, all had a taste. Went off to the museum to all be tested and everything, and it was actually used to preserve a baby. So that's what they used to do, is preserve bodies, because it's a really good preservative. So the more honey you eat, you're going to start preserving yourself. And there used to actually be mellifera men who were medicine men. So I can't remember which ancient civilization, but men in their late 60s and older would donate their body to science. So before they died, they would increase their amount of honey they would eat each day, so that before death, they were only eating honey, and they'd be eating like 5 or 6 kilos of honey a day. So then they would die, and then their body would be donated to the scientists or the doctors, and it would all be chopped up and put in pots and stored for 100 years. And then the pots would be brought out, and they would feed people this mellifera men. So that's something to add to your apothecary. So it's another way of donating your body for science. So this shows just three different colours from one frame of honey. So the bees will actually store the different nectar sources on one frame. So sometimes you'll have a frame of honey and you can just see all these different colours. And actually this summer we extracted some honey from a hive. On one frame we had 11 different varieties of honey on one frame. So it's amazing, but it's not cost effective to extract it in a little pot at a time. So what you tend to do is uncap it, put it in the thing and spin it, which is why you'll have Dorset honey, you know, whatever. It's pouring out. So organic honey, you might have people saying, oh, I only want organic honey, or I only buy organic honey. You cannot get a British organic honey, because there is not an area. And what was even more shocking, I've learned that this is true for North America as well. There is not an area of 5 miles radius that is free of chemicals. That's shocking, isn't it? So this is why I look for honeys in different countries, and this is why I have honeys that are not local, but I go for the single varieties and I go for the quality. So I'm working with beekeepers who are not using chemicals inside the hive, not feeding the bees sugar, and the bees are foraging in great wild areas of really good nectar sources. So that shows, that's one hive, 2 frames next to each other, the different colours, different sources of flowers. So aren't they neat? And there we go, it would take 25,000 flights just to produce that 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. So it really is precious. And I think the main thing I really want to get across to you all is that really be aware of the honey you're using in your medicines, because it really does have, it is a medicine in itself. It's worth investing in a honey that is a proper honey, because if you've got these organic herbs and you get your honey from Booker's, well, for a start, it probably isn't honey, it will just be a sugar syrup.